A widow on an auction block. A stranger with a hidden promise. A poisoned husband. A black ledger full of buried crimes. In the ruthless frontier town of Dust Creek, powerful men believe the law belongs to whoever can pay for it. But Clara Jane Lincoln and Jesse Stone are about to prove them wrong. Together, they will face corrupt officials, hired killers, and a truth dangerous enough to get them both buried in the Texas dirt. This is more than a Western. It is a story about justice, sacrifice, freedom, and the kind of love that helps a broken soul take root again. If you're ready for a powerful journey, like, comment, share, and subscribe.
The red Texas sun didn't rise over the Dust Creek Cemetery that July morning. It bled, it leaked across the flat, cracked rim of the earth like rusty water, turning the dust the color of old iron. Clara Jane Lincoln was on her knees. She had been there since the coyotes stopped howling at 5. Her fingernails were gone, split to the quick, worn down by the gray limestone rocks she was hauling from the creek bed. They were heavy rocks, rough-edged and stubborn, but she needed them. She needed something heavy enough to keep the prairie wind from stealing the dirt off Samuel's face. The soil out here was dry as cornmeal. If you didn't weigh it down, the country just swallowed a man back up, leaving nothing but an unmarked mound for the crows to sit on. Samuel had been under for less than a day. The pine box hadn't even settled into its ruts yet. "That's far enough with them rocks, Clara Jane," a voice called out. It was flat cold, the kind of voice that sounded like dry leather scraping against a fence post. Clara didn't stop. She fitted a sharp piece of limestone right at the foot of the mound, pressing her weight into it until her knuckles went white. Only then did she wipe her bloody palms on her apron and stand up. Gideon Vance was sitting on his big bay gelding, just inside the cemetery gate. He didn't take off his hat. A man like Vance didn't bare his head for dead men, let alone dead men who died owing him greenbacks. He had a piece of yellow ledger paper held between his gloved fingers, tapping it against his saddle horn. Tap, tap, tap. "Preacher's fee was $5, Vance said, his eyes squinting through the glare. "The pine box was 18. The plot you re-standing on belongs to the municipal land office. That's another 12. Add in the 12 for the carbolic acid and the doctor's travel from the junction when Samuel took to shaking, and you re-looking at $47. Clara Jane, even." Clara took a slow breath. The air tasted like heat and old pine. "The house is paid through autumn, Mr. Vance. Samuel gave you the gold before the heat set in. The house was paid when Samuel had a pulse," Vance said. He leaned forward, resting both hands on the saddle swell. "Under the laws of this county, a woman without a male head can hold a property deed, not independently. That cabin reverts back to the town to clear the estate's debts. You've got till sundown tomorrow to vacate." Clara felt the ground beneath her boots hard, unforgiving Texas dirt. She looked at the fresh grave, then looked up at the man on the horse. She didn't flinch. She didn't let her chin drop a quarter of an inch. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice carrying clear across the quiet graveyard, "the laws of this county might give you the right to seize my roof now that Samuel is under the sod. They might let you take the wood and the stone. But the law of Almighty God does not give you the right to treat a woman's dignity as collateral. I am a human soul, not a stray mule to be traded off to clear a ledger. I will pay every red cent of that $47 with the honest labor of my hands, but I will not bow my head to your cruelty." Vance let out a dry, rattling laugh. It sounded like a grasshopper in a jar. "With what hands, girl? You re-18. You've got no kin from here to the Sabine River. The laundry has taken. The bakery don't want to go a young widow around the Christian wives. You want to talk about the law of God. The law of this territory says you pay, or the town finds someone to pay for you." He flicked his wrist. The yellow paper fluttered, then landed in the dirt right at Clara's boots. "Don't bother packing the trunk," Vance said, turning his horse. "The sheriff's already got the ledger signed." He trotted away, the bay's hooves kicking up puffballs of gray dust that hung in the stagnant air. Clara stood alone for a long time. The silence came back, thick and heavy, broken only by the dry rattle of cicadas in the mesquite bushes. She didn't cry. Tears didn't buy timber, and they surely did pay for a grave. Slowly, she reached down and picked up the paper. It wasn't a bill. It was a copy of the notice nailed to the livery post in the center of town. The ink was fresh, thick and black. An order of municipal labor auction by order of the Dust Creek authorities. Any woman of unsettled debt may offer a 1-year labor covenant to the highest bidder in exchange for full debt clearance. Saturday, July 14th, high noon. Town Square's hand stayed perfectly steady, but her chest felt tight, like a rawhide strap drying in the sun. She knew what that notice meant. Everyone in the territory knew. It wasn't about labor covenants. It was the law's way of selling off women who had nobody left to stand between them and the world. It was a meat market with a judge's seal on it. She looked back down at the rocks around Samuel's grave. She had built the border straight. Every stone was locked tight against the next. She didn't go back to the cabin to pack. Instead, she walked down the long, dusty road toward the town square. She didn't walk like a woman being dragged to the slaughter. She walked with her head up, her spine straight as a rifle barrel. If they were going to put her on that wooden block, she would step up onto it herself. She would look every man in Dust Creek in the eye while they yelled out their prices, and she would make them remember the day they decided a woman's freedom was worth $47. The noon sun over the Dust Creek square didn't feel like weather. It felt like an anvil. It came straight down, heavy and white, burning the grease right out of the wagon axles and making the pine boards of the town platform sap-sticky. Clara Jane Lincoln stood on the second step of that platform. Her boots were covered in the red dust of the cemetery, but her apron was straight. She looked over the heads of the 30-man crowd gathered in the dirt. Most of them she knew by name. There was Miller, the blacksmith, wiping soot from his brow. There was Old Man Higgins, leaning on his cane. They wouldn't look her in the eye. They looked at their boots, or they looked at the sky, or they looked at the bottle of rye passing between them. They were decent neighbors on a Sunday. Today they were just buyers. Gideon Vance stood at the center of the boards, his waistcoat unbuttoned against the stifling heat. He held his silver-headed cane like a gavel. $47 is the debt to the municipality. Vance's voice cut through the heavy air, sharp and unbothered. We got a 1-year covenant on the labor of Clara Jane, widow of the late Samuel Lincoln, clear title, clean record. Who opens the bid to satisfy the county? $20, a voice called from the back. It was Pete Evans, a dirt farm from the flats. He needed a hand to pick cotton, and he didn't care about the name on the ledger. 20 I have. Vance droned. Do I hear 30? 30, another voice barked. Clara felt a cold knot tighten in her belly. She knew that voice. It belonged to Luke Miller. He wasn't the blacksmith's kin. He was a border country scout who drove freight wagons down to the railhead saloons near the Mexican line. He had yellow teeth and eyes that stayed wet, like an old hound's. He didn't want a field hand. He wanted something he could put in the back of a covered buckboard and sell to the miners in Fort Worth by McComas, 35. Evans grunted, wiping sweat from his neck, 38. Miller countered. He stepped closer to the platform, his spurs clinking in the loose dirt. He looked up at Clara, his eyes crawling up her skirt to the collar of her shirt. He smiled. And not a penny more. She ain't built for the plow, Evans. Let the gentleman handle the light work. Evans spat a stream of dark tobacco juice into the dust and shook his head. He walked away. $38 going once, Vance called out, his eyes scanning the crowd. He raised his cane. 38 going twice, $50. The voice came from the hitching rail at the far edge of the square. It wasn't loud, it didn't shout, but it had a strange flat ring to it, the sound of a heavy horseshoe hitting an anvil. The crowd parted like sheep before a timber wolf. He was standing by a big, raw-boned Appaloosa stallion. He wore a dun-colored trail coat that had seen 500 miles of prairie dust. His hat was pulled low, casting a dark wedge of shadow across a face that looked like it had been carved out of river rock with a dull knife. He didn't carry a Colt on his hip, just a short-barreled carbine slung in a leather scabbard beneath his stirrup leather, and a small boot knife tucked behind his knee. He looked 25, maybe 26, but his eyes were old. They were the color of winter river ice. Jesse Stone didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look at Vance. He kept his eyes right on Luke Miller's boots. Vance blinked, his cane freezing mid-air. 50, mister. This is an official municipal auction. We need to see the coin before we take the bid. Jesse walked forward. His boots didn't hurry. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a heavy leather pouch, and dropped 2 gold double eagles and a silver half-eagle onto the wooden table at the foot of the steps. They hit the pine with a solid, metallic thud that put an end to the whispering. 50, Jesse said again, and the paperwork gets signed now. Luke Miller turned on his heel, his hand dropping naturally toward his belt. He took one look at the stranger's shoulders broad, sloped, and perfectly still and stopped. There was something about the way the stranger stood that suggested he had spent a lot of time behind a sight leaf, waiting for things to stop moving. "You're paying too much for a go-a-foo, friend," Miller spat, trying to salvage his pride before the town. "She ain't worth 20 to a man who knows horses." Jesse didn't answer him. He didn't even acknowledge the breath it took for Miller to speak. He stepped up to the table, took the iron quill from the inkwell, and wrote his name across the municipal ledger, Jesse Stone. Then, without looking up, he held the quill out toward Clara. "Sign your name under mine, ma'am," he said. His voice was quiet, a low Virginia drawl that had been scraped raw by Texas wind. Clara stepped down the 3 wooden tiers. Her knees were shaking, but she held her chin straight. She took the feather pen from his calloused hand. Her fingers brushed his. They felt like warm iron. She looked at the paper. Right below his signature, in neat small script that didn't match his rough clothes, he had added 3 words: "Contract voided upon demand." Clara stopped. She looked up into his winter-gray eyes. "Mr. Stone," she whispered, her voice cracking in the dry heat. "The clerk told me this morning. Under the 1871 Homestead Act and the state statutes of Texas, a labor covenant is legally binding for 12 calendar months. A magistrate can put a woman in the county jail if she walks off the land before the term is satisfied. You can't just write your own rules on a public ledger." Jesse looked down at the paper, then back at her. His expression didn't change by a hair. "The territory might have its statutes, Mrs. Lincoln," Jesse said. "Loud enough for Vance to hear but soft enough to keep it between the two of them. And a county judge can sign whatever piece of paper makes him feel like a big man. But no law written by men can strip the free will out of a human soul unless that soul agrees to the shackles. I bought that paper from Vance so Luke Miller wouldn't put you in the back of his wagon. The $50 is gone, and the county is satisfied. But as far as I'm concerned, you're a neighbor, not an asset. If you want to walk down to the stage stop right now and take the coach to Houston, you go on ahead. The road is yours." Clara stared at him. The crowd was drifting away now, disappointed there hadn't been a shooting. But Luke Miller remained by the saloon wall, his eyes fixed on the Appaloosa. "I have no money for a stagecoach, Mr. Stone," Clara said, her voice dropping lower, "and I have nowhere to go but the dirt Samuel left me." Jesse picked up his leather pouch and tucked it back into his coat. He turned toward his horse. "Then we'd best get your trunk before the sun goes down," he said. "The boarding house on the creek road has 2 rooms vacant. I paid the landlady for a month this morning." He didn't wait for her to thank him. He didn't offer her his arm. He just took the stallion's reins and started walking down the dusty lane, leading the horse with one hand and leaving 3 paces of clear air between his shadow and hers. The boarding house at the edge of the creek road was built of rough-hewn cedar that smelled of turpentine when the evening coolness finally hit the valley. It sat low in the mesquite flats, away from the noise of the town saloons, its tin roof rattling occasionally as the prairie breeze came up from the south. Jesse Stone carried Clara a small wooden trunk into the corner room on his shoulder. He set it down against the wall with a soft click, careful not to mar the cedar floorboards. Clara stood by the window frame, her fingers twitching against the linen of her apron. She had her small paring knife tucked into the waistband of her skirt, hidden beneath the folds. She had lived in Texas long enough to know that $47 didn't buy a man's silence, and it certainly didn't buy his modesty. She watched him as he walked around the small pine table in the center of the room. "The window looks out toward the corral," Jesse said, pointing with a blunt finger. "The latch is iron. It catches tight from the inside." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy iron key, setting it down on the pine table between them. "That's for the door," he said. "The landlady, Mrs. Gable, is a Christian woman. She don't allow boots in the parlor after 8, and she don't ask questions about who sleeps where. I'll be out on the porch with the stallion." Clara didn't touch the key. She kept her back to the window, the evening light silhouetting her slight frame. "Mr. Stone," she said, her voice dropping into the steady rhythm she used when she was frightened but refused to show it. "A man doesn't part with $50 2 months' wages for a cavalry scout just to sleep on a porch plank and look at the stars. My father was a sergeant in the Louisiana infantry. He taught me how the world reckons accounts. He told me that when a man gives you something for nothing, he's just hiding the receipt until you read too far from home to say no. What is it you want from me?" Jesse stopped near the door frame. He took off his hat for the first time since she had seen him in the square. His hair was dark and cropped short, like a soldier's, and there was a pale band of skin across his forehead where his hat usually sat. He didn't look angry. He looked tired, the kind of tired that comes from carrying something heavy for too many years. Your father was a soldier, Mrs. Lincoln, so he knew how men look at things through a ledger, Jesse said, his voice flat and even as a carpenter's level. But he also knew that out here on the frontier, the only thing keeps us from turning into savages is the way we treat the folks who can't fight back. I don't want your cookery, and I don't want your laundry. I bought your name off that block because I seen what Luke Miller does to women who don't have a brother or a father to put a chunk of lead in his brisket. A person's life ain't a horse trade, ma'am. You don't owe me a thing but your own safety. When you're ready to leave, you tell me, and I'll help you grease the wagon wheels. Until then, you lock that door from the inside. And you don't answer to nobody but yourself. He nodded once, a brief sharp motion, and stepped out onto the porch, pulling the heavy cedar door shut behind him. A second later, Clara heard the solid sound of his boots against the porch planks, followed by the low, rumbling grunt of the Appaloosa stallion as Jesse settled down into the grain sacks by the rail. She walked over to the table and picked up the iron key. It was cold, heavy, and real. She went to the door, turned the mechanism, and listened to the bolt click into the oak frame. The room went dark as the sun finally dropped below the western ridges. Clara didn't light the tallow candle on the washstand. She sat on the edge of the small shuck mattress bed, listening to the night sounds of the Texas border country. Through the window, she could see the silhouette of Jesse Stone. He was sitting on a grain sack with his back against the porch post, his carbine resting across his knees. He had a small block of cedar in his left hand and his pocket knife in his right. Shuck, shuck, shuck! The sound of his knife shaving the wood was rhythmic, like the ticking of an old grandfather clock. He wasn't making anything, just shaving the cedar down into thin, fragrant curls that fell into the dust around his boots. As the hours passed, Clara watched the way he moved. He didn't move like a townsman. Every few minutes his head would turn slightly toward the road, his eyes scanning the dark line of the mesquite bushes. When a coyote yelled out by the creek, his hand didn't jump to his gun, it simply tightened on the stock, his body adjusting its weight without a sound. She rose from the bed and walked to the washstand to pour some water into the tin basin. As she lifted the pitcher, she looked through the small, cracked mirror on the wall. She looked older than 18. Her skin was tanned by the high plains sun, and there were dark circles under her eyes from the 3 days she had spent watching Samuel shake himself to pieces in the cabin. She washed her face in the cold water, the smell of cedar and dust filling her nose. When she looked back out the window, the moon had come up over the creek, throwing a long white sheet of light across the porch. Jesse had laid his coat down on the planks and was using his saddle for a pillow. His long legs were stretched out straight, his boots crossed at the ankles. He looked small out there under the vast black Texas sky, just one man with an empty pocket and an old horse. But as Clara turned the iron key back in the lock and lay down beneath the wool blanket, she realized her hands had stopped shaking for the first time since the preacher had read the words over Samuel's pine box. She didn't know what the morning would bring, or what Gideon Vance had written in his secret books, but she knew that the porch planks were thick, the lock was iron, and the stranger outside was keeping the night at bay with nothing but a pocket knife and an old cavalry carbine. The sun didn't crawl into the valley the next morning. It slammed down like a hot furnace door. By 8 o'clock, the air inside Samuel's old cabin was thick enough to choke a mule. It smelled of dry pine, old grease, and the faint, sweet tang of rot that always lingers after a man takes his last breath in a small room. Clara Jane Lincoln didn't want to be there. But a woman's life in 1878 didn't give her the luxury of avoiding hard places. She stood in the center of the dirt floor, her apron pockets already heavy with her father's old leather-bound books. Jesse Stone was by the door. He didn't come inside. He stayed on the threshold, his frame blocking out the bright glare of the yard, his gray eyes moving over the timber walls with a slow military caution. "The wagon greased," Jesse said. His voice was low, hitting the quiet room like a soft stone dropped in a well. "We take what fits. The rest stays for Vance's men." Clara didn't answer. She walked to Samuel's old oak desk, the only piece of furniture he'd brought from Louisiana that wasn't put together with wooden pegs. She pulled the bottom drawer out all the way. Her fingers knew where to look. Samuel had been a quiet man, a man who kept his thoughts tucked behind his teeth, but he was clumsy with his secrets. There was a false bottom in the pine casing. She pried it up with her small paring knife. Inside lay a small black-bound pocket ledger. It wasn't the kind of book a farmer used for corn yields. She opened it. The pages were covered in Samuel S. Tight, clerkish script dates, land boundaries, and a list of 7 names. Samuel S.'s own name was at the bottom. Next to it, a date, July 3rd, 2 days before he took to the bed with the shaking fits. Clara felt her blood go cold. She closed the book, her thumb pressing into the cheap leather. "Mr. Stone," she said, her voice dropping into that steady, rhythmic cadence. "Look here." Jesse stepped into the room then. His boots made no sound on the packed dirt. He took the book from her hand, his thick thumb flipping through the pages. He didn't read like a schoolteacher. He read like a scout looking at an old trail map, his eyes narrowing at the numbers. "This ain't a debt ledger," Jesse muttered. "No," Clara said. "Samuel was working the desk at the county land office last winter. He told me once that the cattle barons were moving the fence lines on the Federal Creek plots. He said if a homesteader didn't sell out cheap, the water just seemed to dry up. I thought he was just talking out of turn. But look at them names. Miller's brother is on there. Old man Higgins' boy is on there. Both of them died last winter. The town said it was the winter fever." Jesse didn't say a word. He tucked the ledger into his trail coat, his face hardening until he looked like something dug out of a quarry. They drove the buckboard out to the edge of the creek flats, where Ruth Abernathy's sod house sat under the shade of 3 stunted cottonwoods. Ruth was old. Her face looked like a boot that had been left out in the rain for a season. But she'd have been a nurse with the Western Sanitary Commission during the war. She knew what a human body looked like when it was finished with this world. Ruth sat on a 3-legged stool, her old hands sorting dried Jimson weed into a tin bowl. She listened to Clara talk about Samuel's final hours, the sudden vomiting, the way his skin went yellow like an old gourd, the burning in his belly that water couldn't quench. When Clara finished, the old woman didn't look up from her weed. She spat a dark stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "Under the state penal code of Texas, Mrs. Lincoln," Ruth said, her voice like gravel shifting in a bucket, "a local doctor can sign a burial certificate for cholera without opening the chest cavity if there's a pestilence in the county. It keeps the panic down and it keeps the graves digging fast. But cholera don't turn a strong man's skin the color of a butter pat in 36 hours without a single speck of cramp in the calves. What you're redescribing to me ain't the water sickness, that's arsenic. Old-fashioned Thactin, bought by the pound at the cattle dip station. Someone was putting it in his coffee pot, regular as a clock, until his liver just quit on him." Clara sat on the edge of the woodbox. The room seemed to tilt slightly under her feet. "Vance," she whispered. Jesse was leaning against the sod wall, his hand resting on the iron butt of his carbine. He didn't look surprised. A man who had seen 15,000 men break against the rocks at Antietam didn't lose his breath over one more murder in the chaparral. "Out here on the frontier, Clara Jane," Jesse said, using her Christian name for the first time, his voice low and rhythmic as a steady horse pace. "The law is nothing but a shadow cast by the man with the biggest herd. The 1,862 Homestead Act gave every free citizen the right to claim 160 acres of public land. Plain and simple. If they had the sand to clear the brush and build a roof. But the law don't give you the Winchester to keep it. Men like Gideon Vance don't see land as soil, they see it as grass for greenbacks. If a clerk like Samuel starts looking too close at the county deeds, a pinch of gray powder in his flour sack is cheaper than buying out his title." He stood up straight, his broad shoulders clearing the low doorway of the sod hut. "We got 48 hours before the circuit judge passes through the junction," Jesse said, looking out toward the shimmering heat waves on the road. "Vance knows what was in that desk. He knows you got it, or he knows I do. The buckboard's loaded. We don't go back to the cabin." Clara stood up beside him. Her hand went to the small black book in his pocket, her fingers touching the leather through the cloth. "Are you going to run, Mr. Stone?" she asked. Jesse didn't look at her. He looked down the road toward Dust Creek, where the tin roofs of the saloons were catching the white noon glare like mirrors. "I spent 3 years running from things I couldn't fix in Virginia," he said softly. "The horse is tired, Clara Jane, and the dirt out here is as good as any to make a stand." The twilight came down cold and blue over the creek flats. They had pulled the buckboard into a dry wash 3 miles north of town, where the high cut banks hid the horses from the road. Jesse didn't light a fire. A fire was an invitation in a country where the neighbors used rifles to ask questions. He sat on an upturned hardtack box, a small piece of grease rag in his fingers, working the oil into the slide of his carbine. Click, clack, click. Clara sat under the wagon seat, her knees drawn up against her chest to keep out the damp chill that always follows a Texas sunset. She watched his hands. They were big hands, scarred across the knuckles by old ropes and older iron, but they moved with a strange, delicate patience when they touched the gun. "You're a long way from Virginia, Mr. Stone," she said. Her voice was just a whisper against the dry rattle of the cottonwood leaves above them. Jesse stopped the grease rag. He reached into his coat, not into the pocket with Samuel S. black ledger, but into the deep leather lining near his ribs. He pulled out a piece of paper that looked like it had been through a cattle stampede. It was folded into a tight, greasy square, the edges worn down to gray lint. He didn't give it to her. He held it in his palm, his eyes fixed on the tattered shape of it. "I didn't come to Dust Creek for the stallion trade, Clara Jane," Jesse said. His voice had that slow conversational rhythm, like an old farmer talking over a rail fence at dusk. "No," he said. "I came because of this." He unfolded the paper with his thick fingers, handling it as if it were made of thin ice. "This was wrote in November of last year," Jesse said. "It took 6 months to find me at the horse pens in Fort Worth. It's from William Fontenot, your father." Clara stopped breathing. The dry wash went perfectly still. Even the Appaloosa stallion stopped chewing his grain sack by the wheel. "My father died in the winter," she said, her voice tiny and sharp, "in New Orleans, of the lung rot." "He knew he was dying when he set the pen to this," Jesse said. He held the paper out to her then. Clara took it. Her fingers were trembling so hard the paper rattled like dry grass. There was no moon yet, but her eyes knew her father's script bold. Heavy strokes, the writing of a man who spent 20 years signing supply manifests for the infantry. She couldn't read it in the dark, but she didn't have to. "Your father was my sergeant at Antietam, Clara Jane," Jesse said, his eyes looking past her, out into the dark chaparral where the shadows were thickening. "I was 15 years old when the Keep Bean, the Union cavalry, cut through our line at the cornfield. I was down in the mud with a splinter of oak through my knee, just waiting for the horses to trample me into the dirt. William Fontenot didn't know my name. He didn't know my kin. But he came back through the grape shot and carried me 2 miles on his shoulders to the field hospital. He told me then that the military regulations didn't say nothing about leaving a boy to die in a ditch just because the colors were wrong. He gave me my life, Clara Jane, plain and simple, and a man don't ever clear that kind of debt off his ledger." Clara pressed the paper against her apron, her eyes burning in the dark. "What did he ask you to do?" "He said Samuel was a good clerk but a weak man," Jesse said softly. "He said he sent you out here to Texas with a man who didn't have the sand for the frontier. He asked me if I was still drawing breath and holding a gun to find this town," he said. "Look after my girl, Jesse. She's got her mother's pride, but she don't know how the wolves smell out on the plains." He stood up, his tall frame cutting off the starlight above her. He took the oil rag and tucked it back into his saddlebag. "Under the military laws we fought under, Clara Jane," Jesse said, his voice dropping into that deep rhythmic cadence that felt like a steady hand on a horse's reins. "An officer else command ends when the muster roll is called and the guns are stacked in the courthouse yard. The state don't pay a soldier to keep his promises after the treaty is signed in ink, but there's a higher law than the ones written in the Army manuals. It's the law of a man's own skin. If I had stayed in Fort Worth and let Luke Miller put his hands on you last Saturday, I wouldn't be nothing but a coward with $50 in his pocket. I came to this town to find you because your father gave me the 30 years I've lived since that cornfield. I'm just paying back the principal on the loan, ma'am. The interest is up to you." He walked over to the horse, his hand going to the stallion's nose to keep him quiet as a low rumble of hoofbeats echoed from the main road a mile away. Clara sat in the dark wash, the tattered letter pressed against her ribs. The paper felt warm against her skin, warmer than the Texas night. She looked at Jesse's silhouette against the ridge, broad, still, and perfectly steady. She had thought she was alone in the territory. She had thought the $47 was a weight that would drag her down into the red dirt until she was nothing but a name on a pine board. But as she folded her father's letter and tucked it into her blouse, she realized the stranger wasn't a stranger at all. He was an old debt, come due at just the right time, and he had enough iron in his blood to balance the books for the whole county. The Rimrock Canyon 3 miles north of the dry wash didn't have a name. It was just a scar in the limestone, deep enough to hide the sound of a gunshot from the main stage road. The sun hit the white rock walls and bounced back down, twice as hot, baking the grease on Jesse a small pocket revolver until it smelled like burnt lard. Clara Jane Lincoln held the gun with both hands. It felt small, too small for the weight of the country around her. But her fingers were locked around the checkered walnut grip like iron. The barrel less short, Jesse said. He was standing 2 paces back, his arms crossed over his dun coat. He didn't touch her. He didn't fix her fingers, he just watched. It ain't an infantry rifle, Clara Jane. You don't aim at a patch of wool 100 yards out. You wait till you can smell the grease on a man's vest. Clara took a breath. The heat in her throat tasted like sulfur and dry flint. She looked at the target, an empty lard tin set against a red clay bank 20 feet away. Crack! The little gun jumped. A puff of blue-black powder smoke hung in the dead air between her and the bank. The tin didn't move. The bullet went wide to the left, kicking up a small fountain of red dust that settled back down into the gravel. "You're flinching before the hammer drops," Jesse said. His voice had that slow walking horse pace. "You're expecting the kick. A gun ain't a mule. Clara Jane. It don't kick to hurt you. It kicks because the iron is letting go of the fire. You got to let it happen." Clara lowered the piece. Her right wrist was sore, the skin between her thumb and forefinger red from the brass frame. "It's easy for you to say, Mr. Stone. You spent 3 years behind a sight leaf. My father left his pistols in the armory when he came home to Louisiana. I never handled nothing heavier than a kitchen steel." Jesse walked over to the bank. He picked up the lard tin, looked at the smooth, unmarred side of it, and set it back down. "Under the 1871 Militia Act and the common regulations of this territory, Clara Jane," Jesse said, his voice carrying clear against the canyon stone, "a woman can be fined $5 for carrying an unholstered weapon inside the municipal limits of a town. The law says a woman's defense is the business of the county sheriff or her legal guardian. But a county sheriff don't sit on the edge of your bed when Luke Miller's men are kicking the door latch off the frame at midnight. The law can write all the paragraphs it wants about public safety, but when the room goes dark, your only legal guardian is the 3 inches of lead inside this cylinder. If you don't know how to drop that hammer without blinking, you're just carrying a heavy piece of hardware that belongs to the first man strong enough to take it from you." He walked back to her, his shadow long and thin against the white gravel. He pulled 3 more cartridges from his vest pocket, lead balls fixed to small copper caps, and dropped them into her palm. "Again," he said. Clara didn't argue. She loaded the cylinders, her fingers steady now, her mind fixing on the image of Luke Miller standing by the saloon wall with his wet hound's eyes. She raised the iron. She didn't look at the barrel. She looked at the black lettering on the lard tin. She let her breath out slow, until her ribs felt empty. Crack! The tin jumped. It spun twice in the dirt, a clean, jagged hole punched right through the middle of the letter O in lard. Jesse didn't cheer. He didn't smile. He just nodded once, a sharp military motion of his chin. "That bullet would have hit a man right in the brass buttons," he said. "Now clean the cylinder. The powder residue out here will rust the chambers before sundown if you let the sweat get to it." They sat under the ledge of the rim rock to wait out the noon heat. Clara used a corner of her apron to wipe the black soot from the revolver's breech. Jesse was working on a leather strap, punching holes with his awl. "Mr. Stone," she said after the cicadas had filled the silence for a long mile, "I want to take that ledger to the circuit judge myself when the stage hits the junction tomorrow." Jesse stopped the awl. He didn't look up from the leather. "Vance has 2 riders watching the junction road since yesterday morning. I seen their tracks by the water hole." "I ain't afraid of his riders," Clara said, her voice dropping into that rhythmic southern cadence. "Samuel died because he was too quiet. He thought if he just kept his head down and wrote the names in his little book, the world would leave him his 60 acres. I tried keeping my head down at the cemetery, and Vance offered me to the highest bidder before the grave dirt was dry. I'm done hiding in the washes." Jesse pulled the leather strap tight. He looked at her, then really looked at her, his winter gray eyes steady under the dark brim of his hat. "There's a difference between Duncam true bravery and just being tired of the dark, Clara Jane," Jesse said, his voice dropping low, sounding like an old soldier talking around a cold campfire. "The 1866 Civil Rights Act gave every person born in this country the right to testify in a court of law, regardless of who their kin was or what color their skin is. The federal judges at the Fort Worth district will take that ledger from your hand, and they'll sign the warrants for Gideon Vance because the federal government don't like cattle barons stealing timber off public land." But a federal judge stays in a brick courthouse with 3 deputies outside the door. He don't ride the road between here and the junction. If you show your face on that road before the marshal's men get off the train, Vance won't bother with a court clerk or a legal defense. He'll just bury you where the coyotes can find you. And the circuit judge will find nothing but an empty buckboard and a dead stallion. He stood up, slinging his carbine over his shoulder. We go into town tonight, Jesse said, looking up at the sun as it began to slide toward the western hills. But we don't go through the square. Vance keeps his books in the office behind the land registry. If we can get the master deed copies Samuel was talking about, we don't need to wait for the judge at the junction. We send him straight to the U.S. Marshal at Fort Worth by the midnight mail rider. Clara stood up beside him, tucking the walnut-handled revolver into the deep pocket of her skirt. The iron felt cold against her thigh, but it didn't shake. Then let's get the horses, she said. The sun's dropping fast. The town of Dust Creek didn't sleep at midnight. It just got meaner. The wind had died down, leaving the smell of stale beer, horse manure, and cheap coal oil hanging over the single street like a fog. From the back alley behind the land office, Clara could hear the tinny rattle of a piano over at the Lone Star Saloon 3 blocks away. Jesse Stone was a shadow against the cedar siding of the land registry. He didn't move for 5 minutes. He just stood there, his head turned toward the front street, listening to the hoofbeats of a lone rider passing by the livery stable. When the street went quiet again, he reached down and pried at the bottom sash of the rear window with his paring knife. The wood was old. It gave way with a soft splintering sigh that sounded like an old man turning over in a straw tick bed. He hoisted himself over the sill without a sound, then reached down to take Clara's hand, pulling her up into the pitch-dark room. The air inside smelled of old ink and damp parchment, the smell of Samuel's winter life. Clara knew the room. She had brought Samuel his dinner tin here twice during the freeze, when the county records were being moved from the old courthouse at the crossing. The safe is under the counter, she whispered, her hand guiding Jesse's sleeve through the dark. It's a green iron box from the St. Louis foundry. Samuel said the lock was simple, just 3 turns to the left past the iron rivet. Jesse didn't light a match. He knelt in the dust behind the oak counter, his calloused fingers feeling for the iron dial in the dark. Click, click, scrape. The iron door swung open on greasy hinges. Inside there were 3 heavy leather-bound volumes, the master deeds for the county plots. Clara reached into her apron pocket, pulled out a small dry piece of candle stub and a sulfur match. She struck it against her boot sole. The yellow flare was tiny, casting long, monstrous shadows against the white plaster walls, but it was enough. She flipped the pages of the 1877 volume. Her thumb stopped at section 14, the Creek Flats. There were 6 pages torn out clean from the binding. In their place was a fresh sheet of blue legal paper, signed by Gideon Vance and the town magistrate, registering the entire Homestead Valley as abandoned municipal grazing land. They didn't just move the fence lines, Clara hissed, the match burning down until the heat bit her thumb. They erased the titles completely. Samuel must have found the original filings before they burned them. Look at the bottom, Jesse said. He was looking over her shoulder, his face inches from hers. Right under the magistrate's seal was a list of 6 cash payouts, $47 each, paid to the county land office for estate clearance fees on 6 Goafu whose husbands had died of the winter fever. He was buying the debt from the town, Clara whispered, her voice shaking as the candle stub went out. He wasn't clearing our names, Jesse. He was paying the county to let him take the land before the widows even knew they were broke. Suddenly, the front door of the registry creaked. Jesse's hand came down over Clara's mouth, his other arm gathering her skirts into the tight space beneath the oak counter. They lay frozen in the dirt, their chests pressed together, listening to the heavy rattle of spurs against the pine flooring of the front office. A lantern flickered through the cracks in the counter. The windows open. Gideon, a voice growled. It was Luke Miller. His boots stopped 5 feet from where they lay. Someone's been through the sashes. Gideon Vance walked into the room then. His silver-headed cane made a sharp thump against the boards with every second step. He stopped right by the safe, his silk trousers close enough for Clara to smell the bay rum oil on his coat. "It's the Stone boy," Vance said. His voice was tired, flat, and completely devoid of anger. "He ain't a horse trader, Miller. The clerk at the hotel says he was with the Union Cavalry Trinsat, the scouts at the crossing in '64. He knows how to read a trail. I can find him before the sun comes up," Miller spat. "He has got the girl out at the Creek Road boarding house. The boarding house is public property, Miller, Vance said, his cane tapping against the iron-safe door. Under the state laws of Texas, a citizen can claim self-defense if he shoots a man who breaks his latch at night. We don't need a public shooting before the circuit judge gets to the junction. If that ledger gets into the mail rider's pouch, the district attorney in Fort Worth will have a company of state rangers down here before the grass grows an inch. You take 2 men and you watch the road to the crossing. If the girl tries to leave town, you take her contract back by force. The county ledger says she owes $47 to the municipal authority, and that gives the sheriff the legal right to hold her in the jailhouse until the term is satisfied. Once she sets behind the iron doors, the stranger don't have no legal standing to ask questions, and the stranger, Miller asked. Vance turned toward the open window, the yellow lantern light catching the white streaks in his hair. A drifter don't have no kin in Texas, Miller. If his horse comes back without a saddle, the town just notes it down as an accident of the trail and moves on to the next piece of business. They walked out then, the lantern light fading from the walls, the front door clicking shut with a heavy, final sound that felt like a cell door locking. Jesse didn't move for a long minute. His hand stayed over Clara's mouth until the sound of their horses had died away down the main street. When he finally pulled his hand back, his fingers were wet with her sweat. Clara sat up in the dust, her breath coming short and sharp. They're going to put me in the jailhouse, Jesse. They're going to use their own pieces of paper to shut me up. Jesse stood up in the dark room. He reached into the safe, took the blue master deed volume under his arm, and helped her up from the dirt floor. They can't lock a door that's already been torn off the hinges. Clara Jane, Jesse said. His voice had that hard, rhythmic ring, the sound of iron hitting iron. We got the deeds now, and we got Samuel's book. We don't wait for the midnight mail rider. We ride to the crossing ourselves tonight. If Miller's on the road, we go through the brush. Clara pulled the little walnut revolver from her pocket, her thumb resting on the hammer just like he had taught her in the canyon. I am ready, she said. Jesse looked at the gun in her hand, then looked at her face through the starlight coming through the broken window. I know you are, he said softly. Now let's get out of this office before the moon gets any higher. The gray light before dawn was thin as a worn blanket. It sat low in the mesquite breaks 3 miles north of the crossing, cold and damp enough to make a person forget that the Texas sun would be burning the skin off their neck by noon. Clara Jane Lincoln knelt in the dry buffalo grass behind a thicket of agarita bushes. Her belly felt hollow. It wasn't the kind of hollow that comes from missing a supper of salt pork and hardtack. It was a deep, greasy sickness that started in her throat and turned her mouth taste like old iron every time she tried to draw a full breath. She leaned her forehead against the rough bark of a mesquite root and retched. Nothing came up but a thin, bitter bile that hissed into the dry sand. She stayed there on her hands and knees until her vision stopped spinning. Take a swallow of this, a voice said above her. It was Ruth Abernathy. The old midwife had ridden out from the flats on her cross-eyed mule 2 hours before midnight, her saddlebag smelling of dried horehound and willow bark. She didn't offer Clara a hand up. Out here, you didn't help a woman stand unless her legs were broken. You let her find her own balance. Ruth held out a tin cup filled with a dark, lukewarm tea that smelled of boiled wild ginger root. Clara took a small sip. The heat of it bit her tongue, but it settled the rolling in her stomach after a long mile. She wiped her mouth with the hem of her dirty apron and sat back on her heels. How long you been holding this secret from the stranger? Clara Jane, Ruth asked. She was leaning against her mule's flank, her old fingers sorting through a bundle of dried, slippery elm bark. Since the 2nd week of the freeze, Clara whispered. She didn't look at the old woman. She looked down at her own boots. Before the cholera took Samuel. I knew it when the smell of the coffee pot started turning my stomach at dawn. Ruth spat a brown stream of tobacco juice into the weeds. Under the territorial codes and the Common Marriage Property Acts of 1870, Clara Jane, the old woman said, her voice dropping into that rhythmic, gravelly cadence. A child born to a Goafu within 10 calendar months of her husband's demise is legally recognized as the lawful heir to the deceased's estate. That means Vance can't just seize the cabin by municipal default if there's a living seed of Samuel's blood coming into the world. The law says that child is the primary title holder, and the mother is the legal administrator until the boy hits his majority. But a piece of paper from the Austin registry don't keep a child fed when the county has already noted the mother down as an indebted servant on the public block. "If you tell Jesse Stone about this baby, he'll stay here and buy a fight with Vance riders, just out of a soldier's duty to your father. A man with a rifle can hold a ridge for an afternoon, but he can't nurse a newborn infant in a line rider's shack." Clara stood up slow, her hand going instinctively to the front of her calico skirt. Her waist hadn't thickened, yet the cloth still lay flat against her ribs, but her body felt different. It felt heavy, like she was carrying an extra stone in her pocket that didn't belong to her. "I ain't telling him," Clara said. Her voice had that hard, short pause between the words. "He bought my name off that wooden platform because he promised my father he'd keep Luke Miller's hands off my shoulder. He didn't bargain for a widow with a child in her belly. I won't have a man standing between me and a bullet just because he feels pity for a dead sergeant's ghost." A twig snapped in the brush behind them. Jesse Stone stepped through the mesquite leaves. He didn't have his trail coat on. He was in his gray wool vest, his sleeves rolled up to the elbows, revealing the thick dark hair on his forearms and the white line of an old saber scar near his wrist. He was leading the Appaloosa stallion by the bit ring, his carbine slung loose over his right shoulder. He didn't look at Ruth. He looked right at Clara's hand, where it was still pressed against the linen of her skirt. "The riders are moving off the junction road," Jesse said. His voice was flat, a low drawl that didn't rise or fall by a note. "Miller's taken 2 men down toward the low crossing. They think we're heading for the stage stop." Ruth climbed up onto her cross-eyed mule, her saddlebags rattling against the wood stirrups. "I'm going back to the flats, Mr. Stone. If the sheriff comes looking for the girl, I'll tell him she took the north trail toward the reservation." Jesse nodded once. He waited until the old woman's mule had disappeared into the gray chaparral before he dropped the stallion's reins and walked over to the upturned hardtack box where Clara had left her tin cup. He picked up the cup. He smelled the dregs of the wild ginger tea, his winter gray eyes narrowing just a fraction. "My mother used to boil this root in the spring," Jesse said. He didn't look at her. He looked into the empty cup, down in the Shenandoah Valley. "When my sister was carrying her first boy, she said it was the only thing kept a woman's breakfast down when the summer heat started to rise." Clara didn't flinch. She stood her ground by the agarita bushes, her spine straight as a surveyor's stake. "The water in the creek wash didn't agree with me this morning, Mr. Stone, that's all." Jesse set the tin cup down on the box with a soft metallic click. "You don't have to lie to a man who spent 3 years tracking key bin scouts through the brush." "Clara Jane," Jesse said, his voice dropping into that conversational, walking horse pace. "A scout don't just look at the broken twigs. He looks at the way a horse shifts its weight when the wind changes. I seen you avoiding the grease pan since yesterday morning. I seen the way you hold your arm across your middle when the buckboard hits the ruts in the road. The 1,866 federal statutes say a woman's personal condition is her own business under the privacy of the common law, and no marshal can force her to declare her estate or her kin on a public document. You don't owe me an accounting of what Samuel left you. But if you think I'm staying on this ridge because of some old ink your father signed in Louisiana, you're misjudging the weight of my boots. I ain't staying out of pity, ma'am. Pity don't keep a man's black powder dry when the rain sets in, and it surely don't make a stallion stand when the Winchester starts barking." Clara took a step toward him, her hand dropping into the deep pocket where her little walnut-handled revolver lay. "Then why are you still here, Jesse? The deeds are in your trail coat. You could ride that Appaloosa to Fort Worth in 3 days and leave me with Ruth." Jesse looked out over the flat rim of the prairie, where the first yellow streak of the real sun was beginning to crack the eastern sky like an eggshell. "I'm still here because I haven't finished the circle yet," he said softly. "Now eat some of this dry biscuit. We got 4 miles of open sand to cross before Miller finds out we ain't at the stage stop." The sun didn't go down over the low crossing. It just turned purple and died in the mesquite scrub. They were holed up in an old abandoned line rider's cabin half a mile from the river. The roof had fallen in on the western side, leaving a pile of rotted cedar shingles that smelled of pack rats and old rain. Jesse sat by the glassless window hole, his long legs stretched out across the dirt floor, his carbine resting in the crook of his arm. He hadn't touched his canteen since noon. His lips were dry, the skin around his mouth white with alkali dust. But his hand stayed perfectly steady as he ran a greasy rag down the steel barrel of his gun. "Mr. Stone," Clara said from the dark corner where she was sitting on her wooden trunk, "you told me you spent 3 years running from Virginia. What was it you left behind in the valley?" Jesse didn't move for a long minute. The only sound in the room was the dry shuck-shuck of his rag against the iron. Then, he laid the carbine down across his thighs and took off his hat, letting the cool evening air hit his forehead. "I had a farm," Jesse said. His voice was quiet, a low murmur that sounded like water running under a sheet of river ice. 80 acres of limestone soil near the Shenandoah. My father left it to me when the war took him in '62. I had 20 head of sheep and a cabin with a fieldstone chimney." He stopped, his fingers tracing the walnut stock of his gun. "And a wife," Clara said. "It wasn't a question. Her name was Clara," Jesse said softly, "just like yours. Clara May. We was wed in the spring of '69. I was 18 and she wasn't but 17. She had eyes the color of a cedar berry and hair that smelled like the wild mint grew by the spring house." He turned his head toward the window, his gray eyes looking out into the blue shadows of the chaparral. "Under the homestead exemptions of the state of Virginia after the surrender," Jesse said, his voice keeping that steady, rhythmic beat, "a soldier could claim exemption from federal land taxes for 3 years if he was actively improving the acreage with a plow or a ditch. I didn't have no greenbacks for a team of mules, so I took a job with the Texas and Pacific Railroad, grading track out in the Western Territory to earn the money for a seed crop. I left her alone in the cabin for 4 months. The neighbors' wives said they'd look in on her when the corn was ripe. But the fever hit the valley in August while the cruise was blasting rock at the mountain pass. She went into her labor 2 weeks early, all by herself in that cabin with nobody but an old hound dog to hear her cry out. When I got off the supply wagon at the crossing 3 weeks later, there was 2 small mounds under the cedar trees behind the spring house, one long mound for her, and one tiny one for the boy she didn't have the strength to bring through." Clara sat perfectly still in the dark. She could hear the Appaloosa stallion stamping his hoof in the corral outside, his iron shoe hitting a limestone rock with a sharp, lonely tink. "You think you killed her because you went for the money," Clara said. "I know I did," Jesse said. He stood up, his tall frame filling the window hole, his silhouette sharp against the rising moon. "I spent 7 years riding this western road, thinking that if I just kept moving, the distance would wear the memory out of my skin. I thought that if I didn't ever build a fire or put a roof over my head again, the Almighty would reckon the account settled. But when I seen you on that wooden block in Dust Creek last Saturday, Clara Jane, I didn't see $47 worth of municipal debt. I seen a woman standing all by herself in a world that don't give a damn about a go-a-foo's tears. I stayed because your father gave me my 30 years in the ditch at Antietam. But I'm fighting Vance because I'm done letting the wolves have the folks who are left behind." A low, dull thud echoed from the river trail. It wasn't a coyote. It was the sound of an iron-shod horse hitting the gravel at a trot, then another, and a third. "Jesse," Clara whispered, her hand going to her skirt pocket. "They're here," Jesse said. He didn't hurry. He checked the brass loading gate of his carbine with his thumb, then reached down and pulled the small boot knife from his knee strap, setting it on the window ledge where he could reach it without looking. "You stay behind the chimney base, Clara Jane," he said, his voice dropping into that rhythmic military cadence. "If anyone comes through the door frame, you don't look at his face. You just look at his belt buckle and you drop the hammer like we done in the canyon." The moonlight came through the rotted roof now, throwing long, white bars of light across the dirt floor. Outside, a horse nickered once, then a voice called out through the mesquite scrub, loud, wet, and full of that yellow-toothed grin. "Mr. Stone," Luke Miller shouted. "The sheriff's got the road blocked at the upper crossing. You bring that girl out now with the ledger books, and Vance says he'll let you keep the stallion." Jesse didn't answer. He leaned his shoulder against the cedar frame of the window, his rifle barrel resting on the stone ledge, his eye dropping down onto the brass sight leaf. He didn't look like a man who was afraid to die. He looked like an old clock that had been wound up tight 7 years ago and was finally letting go of the mainspring. "Jesse," Clara said from the dark behind the stones. "Hush now, Clara Jane," he whispered back, his voice steady as a winter river. "The moon's just right. Let 'em get their boots into the gravel." The gravel outside didn't crunch, it hissed. It was the sound of 3 men slipping their boots off their stirrup irons and dropping into the dry wash, their spurs tied down with buckskin strings to keep the silver from clinking against the limestone. Jesse Stone didn't move an inch. He was wedged tight against the rotted cedar frame of the window, his rifle barrel resting on a chunk of fallen chimney stone. His breath was slow, coming in through his nose and out through his mouth, regular as a pendulum on a kitchen wall. "They're split up," Jesse whispered. His voice was just a vibration against the dark timber. Miller says on the left, near the horse trough. The other two are coming through the salt cedar bushes by the corral. Clara Jane Lincoln was behind the stone hearth. Her skirt was tucked tight around her knees. Her hands gripped around the walnut stock of the little pocket revolver. She didn't feel the greasy sickness in her belly now. The adrenaline had burned it clean away, leaving her throat dry as wood ash and her eyes wide enough to see the individual hairs on the Appaloosa's mane through the door crack. Thump! A boot hit a loose cedar shingle outside the rear wall, Mr. Stone. Luke Miller's voice came again, closer this time. Just past the rotted well head. The judge is at the Junction Hotel right now signing the municipal warrants. You're holding federal property under a stolen title copy. That makes you a road agent under the state penal code. You drop the iron and step out, or we burn the timber over your head. Jesse didn't give him a mouth response. He let the brass sight leaf of his carbine drop until it lined up right on the white reflection of the moon sitting on Miller's tin vest buckle. Bark! The Winchester didn't roar, it cracked, short and sharp in the narrow canyon. A man screamed out in the salt cedars, not Miller, but one of the hired riders from the cattle dip station. He went down hard, his boots kicking a frantic rhythm against the gravel like a dying rabbit before he rolled over into the dark wash and stayed still. Flank him, Miller yelled, his voice rising an octave into a terrified shriek. Get behind the chimney. A heavy slug from a Colt .45 ripped through the glassless window frame, showering Jesse's shoulder with white limestone dust and splinters of rotted pine. Jesse didn't blink. He worked the iron lever of his carbine clack-click and fired again into the flash of the bush. Then the door frame splintered. The third rider, a big, red-faced man with a grease-stained hat, slammed through the rotted cedar door, his pistol raised straight toward Jesse's ribs. He never saw Clara behind the stones. Clara didn't wait for him to turn. She didn't think about Samuel, and she didn't think about the $47. She just thought about the little seed of life inside her calico skirt and the way the targets looked in the Rimrock Canyon. She raised the walnut grip and dropped the hammer. Crack! The pocket revolver jumped in her hands. The lead ball caught the red-faced man right in the brass buttons of his suspenders. He gasped, a wet, choking sound like a man swallowing river water, his pistol dropping from his fingers as his knees folded beneath him. He hit the dirt floor with a heavy flat thud and didn't move again. Jesse, Clara shouted through the black powder smoke. I see him, Jesse said. He didn't use the rifle this time. He dropped the carbine onto the dirt, reached down to the window ledge, and took the small boot knife in his right hand. He didn't run. He stepped through the broken door frame into the white moonlight of the yard, his shoulders sloped and perfectly still. Luke Miller was 5 yards out, trying to jam fresh paper cartridges into the greasy chambers of his cylinder with bloody fingers. When he saw Jesse coming through the smoke, his wet hound's eyes went wide as silver dollars. He dropped the loose lead balls into the dirt and went for his bowie knife. It wasn't a long fight. It wasn't the kind of fight they write about in the 5-cent storybooks they sell at the railhead. It was just two men breathing hard in the dust, the sound of steel hitting bone, and then a long, low groan that died away into the dry rattle of the mesquite bushes. When Jesse walked back into the cabin, his right sleeve was dark and wet, but he didn't have no shake in his fingers. He reached down, picked up his hat from the dirt and put it back on his head. The horses are clear, Jesse said. His voice was back to that slow, walking horse pace. We take Miller as buckboard. It's got 2 fresh mules on the tongue. 3 weeks later, the noon sun over the crossing didn't look mean anymore. It was August now, the high summer heat breaking just a fraction as the big white thunderheads began to pile up over the southern ridges, promising the first real rain of the season. Clara Jane Lincoln stood on the porch of the new limestone boarding house at the Fort Worth Junction. She had a fresh linen apron on, the cloth clean and white, free of the cemetery dust and the black powder stains of Dust Creek. The circuit judge, a gray-headed old man named Connolly, who wore a black silk coat despite the humidity, sat at the pine table by the rail. His gold spectacles balanced on the bridge of his nose as he turned the pages of Samuel's black ledger and the blue master deeds they'd pulled from Vance's safe. Marshal Connolly stood behind him, his silver star catching the noon glare like a coin. The evidence is regular, Mrs. Lincoln, the judge said, his pen signing 3 separate pieces of blue legal parchment with a scratchy, official sound, under the 1,875 Federal Enforcement Acts and the revised statutes of the state of Texas. The judge said, looking up at Clara through his glass lenses. A municipal authority has no legal jurisdiction to offer a citizen's labor or person for public auction if the primary debt was incurred through fraudulent ledger entries. Gideon Vance and the county magistrate have been noted down on the district docket for capital conspiracy and second-degree murder in the death of Samuel Lincoln. Your husband's title to the 160 acres on the creek flats is hereby restored to his lawful heirs, clear of all municipal encumbrances. The county ledger is balanced, ma'am. You don't owe this territory a single greenback. Clara took the signed deeds from his hand. Her fingers were whole now, the split nails grown back clean, but her skin was still brown from the plain sun. She looked at her name written in the judge's bold ink, Clara Jane Lincoln. Administrator, thank you, Judge, she said. Her voice was quiet, keeping that steady, rhythmic beat. But the creek flats ain't my home no more. I am selling the timber rights to the railroad crew tomorrow morning. The judge blinked. Sell if that's good soil, young lady. A woman with a child coming could make a living on that acreage. Clara looked through the porch rails toward the corral at the edge of the Junction Street. Jesse Stone was out there. He had his gray wool vest off, his white shirt sleeves rolled up as he worked a long cedar post into a fresh hole he'd dug with his spade. He was building a fence, not a high fence to keep out the cattle, but a straight, tight line of posts to hold the horses from the road. The soil out here is dry, Judge, Clara said softly. If you stay in one place too long, the country just finds a way to bury you in it. I am moving down to the hill country. The judge nodded once, a brief, respectful motion of his chin, and gathered his papers into his leather portmanteau. He and the marshal walked down the steps, their boots making a solid official rhythm against the gravel as they headed toward the train stop. Clara walked down the porch steps and crossed the dusty road toward the corral. Jesse didn't stop his spade when she came up to the rail. He drove the iron point into the white clay thump and shoveled out a heap of gray dirt that smelled of old river gravel. The judge signed the papers. Clara said, leaning her arms against the top cedar pole. Jesse stopped. He wiped the sweat from his eyes with the back of his bare forearm, his winter gray eyes looking down at the signed parchment in her apron pocket. The title's clean, he asked. Clean, she said. He said the baby owns the 60 acres now. He said Vance is going to the federal prison at Huntsville before the winter freeze sets in. Jesse nodded once. He reached into his vest pocket, the small pocket where he used to keep his oil rag, and pulled out a tiny square box made of dark Virginia walnut. He didn't give it to her. He set it down on the top of the fence post between them. Clara opened the latch. Inside lay a handful of tiny, dried gray seeds. They were wrinkled and old, but when she pressed one between her thumb and forefinger, a sharp, clean scent filled the hot Texas air, the smell of wild mint and mountain lavender after a mountain rain. My mother gathered them seeds in the summer of '65, Jesse said. His voice had that low conversational pace, like two old neighbors talking over a ditch at sundown. Under the Agriculture Acts and the land grant mandates for Q Chin Bin the veterans, Jesse said, his eyes staying right on her fingers as she touched the seeds. A man who served his enlistment can claim 80 acres of limestone land in the southern hills near San Antonio without paying a nickel of entry fees, provided he puts down a permanent root crop within 12 calendar months of the filing. I've had that piece of paper in my saddlebag since the surrender, Clara Jane. I didn't ever use it because a man don't need 80 acres of lavender if he's just waiting for the night to wear him out. But the soil down in the hill country is wet, and it don't have no cattle barons moving the fence lines at midnight. It's a good place for a child to learn how to walk. Clara looked at the gray seeds, then looked up into his face. The pale band of skin on his forehead was dark now, tanned by the 3 weeks they'd spent riding the crossing road together, and the winter ice in his eyes had softened into something like the color of river water when the sun hits the deep pools. "You're still a poor horse trader, Mr. Stone," she said, her lips turning up into a small, rare smile. "You spent $50 on a Goafu who didn't have nothing but a dirty apron, and now you're offering to plant your mother's garden on a ridge you haven't even plowed yet." Jesse laid his spade against the corral post and reached out, his big calloused hand coming down over hers as it rested on the cedar rail. He didn't squeeze her fingers, he just held them steady, his skin warm and heavy against her own. "I told you before, Clara Jane," Jesse said softly. "I ain't trading, I'm just staying." The stagecoach for the South Crossing rumbled into the street behind them, the 4 mules shaking their harness irons with a loud, metallic jangle that signaled the end of the town's silence. Clara didn't look back at Dust Creek. She took the walnut box of lavender seeds, tucked it deep into her pocket beside the little revolver, and stepped into the buckboard beside the stranger who had outbid the whole town. The stage driver called out to his team, the long leather reins cracking over the mule's ears, and the wagon rolled away from the junction into the sweeping, purple twilight of the Texas hills. There were many days after that when Clara Jane would look down at her hands and remember the red dirt of Samuela's grave, the white glare of the auction platform, and the cold click of the iron key in the boarding-house door. But as the wagon hit the long, steady rhythm of the southern road and Jessie's shoulder brushed against hers in the dark, she knew that the ledger was finally closed. Some losses aren't just endings, they are the hard, rocky trail that leads a person to the one place where the lavender can finally find the water and take its root in the earth. Some characters in this story may display flawed judgment, emotional instability, or morally questionable choices as part of their personal journeys. These portrayals are intended to explore human emotion and conflict within a fictional context and should not be interpreted as guidance or endorsement.
As this story comes to an end, we are left with more than the memory of a dusty Texas town, a cruel auction block, and a widow who refused to let the world decide the price of her soul. We are left with a powerful reminder that human dignity is not something a government paper, a town ledger, or a wealthy man's signature can give or take away. Clara Jane Lincoln stood at the lowest moment of her life, beside her husband's fresh grave, stripped of protection, property, and security. Yet she never surrendered the one thing no man could lawfully own, her will. Clara's journey teaches us that survival is not always loud. Sometimes it is quiet. Sometimes it looks like a woman standing straight while the whole town looks away. Sometimes it is the courage to sign your name, carry the evidence, learn to defend yourself, and keep moving even when grief is still fresh in your chest. She was treated like a debt, like property, like a problem to be solved by men with money. But she proved that a human life is not a balance on a page. A woman's freedom is not a commodity, and a wounded heart can still become strong enough to choose its own road. Jesse Stone's story reminds us that redemption is often born from old guilt. He came to Dust Creek carrying the weight of a promise, the memory of a dead wife, and the burden of a life he believed he had failed to protect. But in choosing to stand beside Clara, he did not simply repay a debt to her father. He began to reclaim the man he thought he had lost. His strength was not in the carbon he carried or the gold he spent. His real strength was in the restraint, respect, and patience he showed when Clara had every reason to distrust the world. He did not buy her obedience. He bought her time, space, and safety, and then gave her the freedom to decide what came next. The villainy of Gideon Vance shows us how dangerous power becomes when it hides behind the law. He used contracts, auctions, land records, and court language to make cruelty appear respectable. And that is one of the deepest lessons of this story. Not everything legal is just, and not every man who speaks of order is honorable. True justice does not belong to the richest cattleman, the loudest magistrate, or the man with the cleanest ledger. True justice belongs to truth, courage, and the people willing to expose corruption when silence would be safer. This story also teaches us that the past does not have to be a prison. Clara carried grief. Jessie carried regret. Both of them had lost homes, loved ones, and pieces of themselves. Yet together, they discovered that some losses are not the end of the road. Sometimes loss becomes the hard ground where a new life takes root. The lavender seeds Jessie carried from Virginia were more than seeds. They were a symbol of memory, healing, and the hope that something beautiful can still grow in soil marked by sorrow. And perhaps that is the heart of this tale. A graveyard, an auction block, a stolen deed, and a widow's debt could have been the end of Clara Jane Lincoln. But instead, they became the beginning of a new chapter. She did not leave Dust Creek as a defeated woman. She left with her name restored, her child protected, her future reclaimed, and the courage to plant roots somewhere no man could erase her from the page. So as we leave Clara and Jessie riding toward the hill country, we remember this. A person's worth is not decided by poverty, grief, widowhood, or the cruelty of others. It is decided by the strength to keep choosing life when the world offers surrender. The road ahead may still be long, and the soil may still be hard, but where there is courage, mercy, and a hand willing to stay, even the dry